Hello and welcome to Scattered Terrain. My name is Meredith, and today I'm going to be showing you how I make my animated vines. Here's what you're going to need. A handful of the PVA and paper towel twists like we made back in How to Make Trees, some good heavy washers, a pair of scissors, matte ModPodge, a couple of shades of green paint and a paintbrush, liquid super glue, a couple thicknesses of wire and some good wire cutters, some paper, your handy-dandy hot glue gun, along with some squares of parchment paper for a non-stick working surface, and then optionally you'll want some clump foliage and PVA to do a finishing touch. We're gonna start making our vines in very much the same way that I make my trees, by taking one of our PVA paper towel twists and cutting it right down the middle, turning one twist into two vines. Then you'll notice that the scissors really squash the twist down when you're cutting through it, so I'm gonna take a minute here to roll the twist back and forth between my fingers to sort of roll it back into a rounded base. And as you can see here, that gives us the start of two vines. So I'm gonna grab 2 squares of parchment paper to work on, and 2 washers, and then I'm gonna put a generous dollop of hot glue onto the parchment and press the washer down on top of it. Then I'm gonna cover the bottom of my paper towel twist in hot glue and press it onto the center of the washer into the glue that I have seeping up through the hole from below. This creates a nice sandwich of hot glue both above and below the washer and helps guarantee that it's not gonna separate later. Then I'm gonna do the exact same thing again, putting that dollop of hot glue on the paper, pressing the washer down on top of it, coating the bottom of my vine with hot glue, and pressing it down into that still hot glue coming up from underneath the washer in the center. Then hold it for just a moment, and set these guys aside to cool off for a minute while we move on to making leaves. For our leaves, I'm gonna grab that sheet of paper and cut a strip off of it with my scissors about 1 inch wide. Then, in order to make the most of my cuts, I'm gonna fold the paper in half several times so that I've got 4 layers of paper built up in one. Then I'm gonna keep a good firm grip on all 4 layers of paper and use my scissors to cut the beginning of my leaf shape. Now I'm making sure that I'm cutting my leaf out of the edge that has the fold, that way as I cut everything stays together for as long as possible. And I'm just gonna make 2 gently curved cuts that meet at a point. And as you can see, that's holding together well. And then I'm gonna hold it by that point and cut a heart shape into the other end. I find the easiest way to do that is to go ahead and start by rounding off the entire end, and then cutting in a rounded point, flipping the entire leaf over, and repeating that same rounded point from the other direction. And I'll just sweep away the excess here. And as you can see, that gives me these nice long heart-shaped leaves. Now I'm gonna pick up my piece of paper and do that exact same process, but this time I'm going to cut it just a little bit smaller. And as you can see here, I'm keeping my finger holding all of those leaves pressed up against the scissors until I can get better hold of it so that I don't have them go flying apart, because this time I didn't cut it on the fold. And this time I'm gonna skip rounding off the tip and just go straight into cutting down to that point, and flip over and round down to the point on the other side. There we go. And it's all right if you don't have a perfectly even-shaped heart, because nature is generally uneven. I don't like the shape of this though, so I am gonna just cut that rounded down a little more. Flip it over and balance it out just a touch on this side. Yeah, there we go, I'm happier with that. And then coming back to that folded side again, I'm gonna make my smallest leaves here. Generally speaking, I like to do everything in 3s because when you have an uneven number, it tends to make things look more natural. And I tend to do the smallest ones last so that I've had as much practice as possible, because they are quite a bit harder to hold on to while cutting in this heart shape to the top. And there we go, so we've got ourselves 4 leaves in 3 different sizes, which gives us a nice variety to put on a couple of vines. And just clean up a little here. Now my next step might get a little bit messy, so I'm gonna grab one of my plastic crafting trays to work in. And I'm also gonna pull out my jar lid that I use for working with super glue. Then we're gonna bring back over the hearts that we just cut out and spread them out on the paper so that you have good access to each individual heart. You don't wanna have to try and pick these up once you're working with the glue. So we'll just take a moment to spread these all out here. There we go. Next, I'm gonna grab the thickest of my 2 gauges of wire Now you'll notice even though this is a thick gauge of wire, I made sure to get a very soft wire that's easy to bend with my fingers. I don't want to have to work with pliers for this. And I'm gonna unravel it and give myself a good length to work with here. And then I'm gonna cut my length to be just about the same height as my vine overall. And I'm gonna cut one for each of my largest leaves. Next, I'm gonna switch over to my thinner gauge, for which I'm just using florist's wire. Now I want my leaves to wind up at different heights around the vine, so for the thinner gauge wire, I'm gonna cut it to be about 1.5 times the length of my first wire, and then cut that in half. And then I'm going to repeat that exact same process one more time for my smallest leaves that'll also be going on the florist wire. Now that I have all of my wire cut and my leaves ready to go, I'm gonna grab that liquid super glue, give it a good shake, and then I'm going to pour some of it out onto my jar lid so that I can dip the wire into the super glue and then place it down into the center of one of the paper leaves. By having the wire dipped in the super glue, it gives me much more control over exactly where the glue is going. Then after a moment, when the super glue has absorbed into the paper, you can set that one aside to dry and move on to dipping your next piece. Now, if the wire doesn't easily come into contact with the paper, you might just need to spin how you're holding the wire in your finger until you get good contact. And be careful with your other hand that you don't accidentally dip it into that super glue pile that you have waiting on the side there. And that's really all there is to it. You're just gonna follow that same process of dipping the tip of the wire and then lining it up onto your leaf and pressing it in place down your whole line of all the leaves you've cut out. Now with the larger leaves and that thicker wire, if you're finding that you have trouble getting it laying down after you've applied the glue, you can actually use the glue bottle itself to press on your wire to get it to adhere, because super glue, generally speaking, doesn't stick to the bottle it comes in. And let me just make a little bit of room here and then finish dipping and gluing these last 3 leaves, using the bottle as needed to make sure that that's sticking well. I'm just gonna flip him over to make sure I don't accidentally glue him to the tray. And you will find that that thicker wire does make getting the paper to stick the whole length a little bit trickier, so that using the bottom of the super glue bottle is a pretty handy trick. And indeed, we'll use it one more time on the final leaf here. Then once all your leaves are stuck to the wires, you can set these aside to dry. Then once that super glue has had enough time to set up, we're gonna grab our vine bases and our leaves, and once again grab that liquid super glue, and we're gonna wrap our leaf stems around our vines. I'm gonna start by loosening the cap on the super glue so that it's easy for me to just lift it off and use the bottle one-handed, but that I'm not worried too much about drying out the tip while I work. Then grabbing my vine, I'm going to start with one of my smallest leaves that's going to be all the way out at the tip. And before I get started attaching the leaf to the vine, I'm going to use my thumbnail here and give the very tip of the leaf a bit of a gentle curve. Right now the wire is very straight so that we could get it all glued in place, but I want the leaf itself to bend a bit, like this. And then I'm going to continue that bend a little ways onto the wire and do my best to straighten the wire out before that point. Then I'm going to move the wire around on the vine a little bit and play with the position until I've got it somewhere that I'm happy with it. Yeah, I think I like the look of that there. Then I'm going to use my thumb and finger to pinch it in place as best I can, and use my other hand to wrap the remaining wire around the base of the vine, getting as close to the bottom as I can. If it doesn't go all the way, that's fine. Do your best to try and tuck the end of the wire into one of your paper towel folds. That'll help to disguise it a bit. Then we're going to grab the super glue and put a couple drops right at the end of where that wire is to lock it in place. And I'm just going to use that super glue bottle doesn't stick to super glue trick once again to press the wire into the paper towel a bit, just until that glue starts to set a bit. There we go, and then I'm going to go back up to the top and just correct the position of the wire a little bit, make sure it is exactly where I want it to be. And I'm trying to make it look like it sort of moves with the same direction of the twist of the paper towel if I can. And then once I'm happy with it, I'm gonna go ahead and add a couple drops of super glue to help lock it in place. Now from time to time when you're using super glue with paper towels, you will notice a little bit of smoke coming off from a chemical reaction, so I highly recommend during this part of the project that you wear the appropriate level of face mask. And then here's part of the benefit of making 2 vines at a time. I'm gonna set that vine aside to let that super glue set up a little bit, and move to my other vine, once again grabbing one of the smallest leaves, curling it over my finger to give it a bit of a natural bend. then positioning it in a place that I like on the vine, and I want to make sure that I'm positioning it in a different place than where I put the first leaf on the last vine. That way if I put them next to each other on the table, they don't look too similar. So this time I'm going to have the wire go under the vine instead of over the vine. And then once I'm happy with it, I'm going to pinch it in place and use my other hand to feed that wire around. Do my best to put the end of the wire into one of those folds so that it disappears. Oh, and I accidentally twisted the cap back on. Let me get that back off here. Then lock down the end of the wire, come back to the top, tweak the position a bit to make sure I'm still happy, and lock down that side as well. Then we're gonna swap back to our first vine, put the cap back on my super glue so I don't dry it out, and then move on to one of our medium-sized leaves. Once again doing that same thumbnail trick to curl the leaf down a bit to one side. And then this time I'm gonna look to position it a little bit farther down on the vine and trying to go to the opposite side. That way I have a little bit of a visual balance. And just get my hands back on camera here. Yeah, and I think I like it there. So once again, I'm gonna wrap the wire around. And this time, as you can see, I'm actually wrapping the wire in the opposite direction. That gives me a little bit of stability crossing the two wires over each other. And it also is going to make for a little bit of interest on the vine itself that not everything is going uniformly in the same direction. Nature's always a little bit chaotic. Then tack the top and bottom in place. Then this time when we go back to vine number 2, because this one is actually a little bit longer and hanging over more, I'm gonna go ahead and grab another one of the smallest leaves and add that to this vine next. I am, however, still gonna go for trying to go to the opposite side of the last leaf that I put on and aiming for it to come off a slightly different part of the vine. So I'm gonna bring it actually just a little bit farther forward here, and it'll just hug along the outside of the vine. I'm gonna try and tuck into this curl here and wrap tightly around as far as I can to the base. It's not gonna make it all the way down, but I can sort of bring it down next to this wire and it'll blend in a bit. Just tuck that under there a bit. There we go. Lock that down with a little super glue. And here I'm gonna put some into that channel as well because this leaf is in a little bit of an awkward place. And I'm just gonna wait a second because I don't want to glue myself to the vine. Oh, and I disconnected the bottom, so we're just gonna hold it in place for a minute with the bottom of that super glue bottle. Then once that's grabbed hold, we'll move up to our second spot and lock that down. And then we're gonna go ahead and give this guy a little bit of time to set and move back over to our other vine again. So since this is our simpler vine, we're gonna go ahead and move to that third and final leaf size. Once again, starting by bending the leaf into a more natural position and continuing that bend onto the stem, especially with this thicker gauge wire because it's going to be harder for you to wrap this around than it has been with that thinner wire. And so once again, I'm going to try and go opposite the side of the last leaf that I put on and then pinch it into place. And once again, just wrap that wire as firmly as I can all the way to the bottom. Now with the length of this wire, that means it's actually going to wrap all the way around the base of the vine, but that's not a problem because you won't see it. And just make sure it all fits onto the washer here. There we go. And then I'm just going to work the wire the opposite direction, make sure it's all snug up against the vine. All right, that's looking good. So we'll just put a couple drops of the super glue to keep that from moving around, as well as here on the base. And now that it's had a little bit of time to dry and I'm not worried about gluing myself to the vine, we'll come back to our second vine here. Just make sure that wire is fully pressed up against it. And now I'm gonna move to the medium-sized leaf and follow the exact same steps that we just did with the first vine. Now because I'm going to be putting more leaves on this vine compared to the other vine, it's okay for them to be a little bit closer together, but I am still alternating going to the opposite side of the last leaf that I put on. And then finishing up with one of the large leaves, working it into that natural bend. And I'm gonna actually give it a nice curve into the bend since I know I'm gonna be wrapping the wire in this direction. I may as well start it wrapping in that direction before I'm holding it in place. All right, and this guy will come off of that opposite side a little bit lower down, and then get a good firm wrap all the way around the base. Oh, and I've lost my parchment paper there. No worries, it'll stick back on here in just a moment. And get that end tucked in, because we don't want anything hanging off the edge of the washer. Yeah, that is looking good. Just tweak this wire a little more there and lock everything down so that it's not gonna move. And this leaf was getting a little bit loose on the paper, so I'm just gonna add a little bit of extra super glue underneath here. Make sure that that's really stuck down. Once we do our next step with the ModPodge, that'll really help keep things held on. But in the meantime, I don't want anything falling off. So we're gonna go back and just hit a couple of those problem areas that it was starting to pop off and make sure everything is locked in place. Then we'll set him aside to dry as well, get the cap back on our super glue, and give everything a good while to set up because we don't want to move on until this super glue is completely dry. Now that some time has passed and we're absolutely sure that our super glue is completely dry, I'm just going to take a moment to go through and tweak the position of those leaves, really lock in exactly how I want things to look. And once I'm happy with that guy, I'll move over to the other one. Yeah, this leaf just needs to tweak a little bit out. Now, when you're tweaking these wires, you want to make sure that you're holding very firmly against the spot that the wire is touching the vine so that as you push and pull on that wire, you don't accidentally pull it away from your paper towel. Once you're happy with exactly how everything is positioned, it's time to grab our matte ModPodge and a damp brush, and we're going to make sure that those leaves are locked in place. So I start by doing a nice swipe of the underside of the leaf, then coming back over and doing one from above, and then following that same process on every leaf up the vine. Oh, and it looks like I lost that one leaf off the bottom of this vine, but no worries, I'm just gonna coat the end of my wire in ModPodge and stick that leaf right back on. Luckily, ModPodge is mostly made up of glue, so it sticks really well. And while I'm waiting for that to set up just a little bit, I'm gonna switch over to my other vine and do the same thing, making sure that we have all these leaves locked in place with a nice coat of ModPodge. I also like to start with the underside of the leaf as opposed to the top of the leaf because ModPodge, as it gets the leaf wet, may cause it to start to weaken a little, and I don't want to accidentally pull the leaf off of the wire. Then once I've finished painting the leaves on this guy, I'll go back and put ModPodge onto that one final leaf. Oh, and it looks like he has not yet set, so I'm just going to use one finger to sort of hold him in place while I go ahead and give that coating, and come back over the top to let the brush sort of bend the leaf over the wire. Then scrape the extra ModPodge back into my container here off the brush, and I'm going to let these guys dry for a while to really solidify those leaves and give them as much strength as I can. Once the ModPodge on our leaves has fully dried, our next step is to grab our hot glue gun, and we're going to add some texture to the base of the vines. So starting on one of my thin wires, I'm going to just pick a good spot to start the glue and run it down to the base. Then when I get to the bottom, I'm going to do a little bit of a circle to help get rid of any wisps. And then I'm going to move a little ways away from it on the base to start my next line, because you don't want any hot glue to touch itself while it's still hot. Otherwise, they'll just sort of ooze together into a lump, and you'll lose those distinct individual lines. So I'm going to continue working my way around the base, moving about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch away from my last line before making my next line. And I'm making all of these go in the same direction at this point, but I am stopping them at different heights up the vine. And once again, this is the benefit to us working 2 vines at once. I'm now going to set this guy aside to cool a little bit and move to my second vine. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing to vine number 2 that I did to the first vine. Make these nice lines of hot glue that come curling up the base. And I've found that if I start at the washer and move up towards the tip, it's much easier to get that thick base going up to a smaller taper because you can release the pressure of the hot glue gun as you're also pulling away from the vine, and that gives you a lot more control over the overall shape that you're going to get. Oh, and this guy needs his square of parchment paper back so that he doesn't stick to my mat. There we go. Then while he cools, we jump back over to vine number 1, and this time we're going to start in those gaps that we left between, and then curl up going in the opposite direction. That way we're crossing over what we did before. And as I go around, I'm also making sure this time to get a bead of hot glue that's going all the way around the edge of the washer. I don't want to have any shiny bits of metal poking through. I want there to be one texture of hot glue that just goes all the way around. And I'm just gonna work my way all the way around the vine, going in anywhere I see a little gap and adding a trail of hot glue. In the meantime, if you're enjoying the video, why not hit the like button? And then I'm just gonna make sure that that outer rim of hot glue wraps under the base a little bit, make sure that there's no easy way for this to peel up. and press firmly down to that piece of parchment to set him aside to dry. Then we'll switch back over to vine number 2 and do the exact same thing, going into all of those gaps between our first hot glue lines and filling in with new swirls, and making sure to use the nozzle of our glue gun to really paint along the excess glue and blend that whole base together. And make sure we've got that wrapped all the way around the edge and the bottom. Then press firmly down to our parchment so we get a nice smooth flat base, and set these guys aside to dry. Once that has cooled completely, we're ready to move on to our next step. Now from here on out, it no longer matters how many you're making at a time, and there isn't really any point in alternating between 2 vines, so we're just going to use this one moving forward. We're going to grab that matte ModPodge one more time, and our damp brush, and this time instead of just doing the leaves, we're going to go ahead and give the entire vine a good coating. I personally like having a little bit of black paint mixed into my ModPodge. It gives me a nice dark base coat of color in all of my recesses, while at the same time giving me that protective coating from the shellac and glue in the ModPodge. And anytime I can get 2 steps done at once, that is a good thing. Now because this is our shadowy base coat, that means you do want to make sure to get into all those nooks and crannies with the brush, but you also don't want to put on too thick a layer. So it's really just a question of getting a feel for putting some on and pushing it around until you get a nice coating all over. This really helps seal in a lot of those little gaps between the wire and the paper towel as well, so it really helps everything come together as one plant. And during this coat, I also do want to take a second to go back over each leaf and give them a second full coating of the ModPodge, really double up on that support that we've given them. This is a little bit of a delicate project if you've added these leaves on. They are entirely optional. You could just do the twist without the leaves, and it would be a lot stronger at that point. But I really enjoy the character that the leaves give, so for me, it's worth having that extra bit of fragility. And then I'm gonna just give a quick once over here, make sure there aren't any spots I've missed, and there aren't any bits where it's built up or gotten too thick. Do one more swipe under and over all the leaves. Yeah, looking good. And then I'm just gonna pinch the very tip of the vine and paint the spot that I was holding onto it, as well as giving it a coat over the bottom. By doing a total enveloping in the ModPodge, we reduce the chance that it's going to start flaking up from the base. Then just as we did with the hot glue, you're going to set it right back onto the parchment paper and let it dry. Once the vine is completely dry, we're ready to move on to painting. Once again, we're going to get that nice wide brush and make sure it's damp. And for my base coat, I'm going to be using Anita's Acrylic Foliage. It's the green that I use as the base color for pretty much all of my plants, so that means that these guys will blend in really well with all of my terrain. And we'll get a good amount onto our palette here, spend a minute working a little bit of the paint into our brush so that we'll get good coverage. And so we're just going to give it a good once over on the whole vine, getting a nice healthy coverage with this green. And just as we did with the ModPodge, you want to make sure that you get both the top and bottom of all the leaves. And make sure that you're working into those little crevices and folds, because we don't want any really stark black bits jumping out at us. And we'll get this guy over here as well. And make sure we've worked that all the way down to the base and in between all those little nooks and crannies caused by the hot glue. And here's part where that parchment paper comes in handy. I can change my grip and hold it by the parchment paper and paint those areas that I was covering with my fingers while I was holding the vine to paint the top. This way we can get the whole base coat done at once and don't have to come back and recover these areas. Then give him a quick once over, make sure we aren't missing anything. Oh, looks like we need a little bit more here. Oh goodness, and I missed the underside of this leaf too. Let's see. Yeah, he's looking good. So we're gonna set him aside to dry, and then take all this extra paint and go do the rest of the vines. Now as you can see here, with using cheap craft paints, the first coat, generally speaking, isn't going to give you good enough coverage. So we're going to want to do that exact same step over again and just do a full base coating with that foliage green. This time you don't have to be quite as careful getting into all of the nooks and crannies as you did on the first coat, because now anything that gets left behind is already going to be a dark shade of green. This time you really just want to make sure that you're getting good coverage over all the high points. Once again, taking special care to do both the bottoms and tops of all those delicate little leaves. And then just do a quick once over here, make sure there's not any bits that I missed. Lovely. And once again, we'll set him aside to dry. Once that second coat's dry, I'm much happier with the amount of coverage I've got. So now I'm gonna peel him up off his parchment and make sure that we've colored the bottom of him green as well. Let's just make sure that we don't have any lumps sticking off here that'll keep him from sitting flat on the table. Oh, a little bit here. There we go. Then grabbing that same foliage green, we're gonna give a healthy coating to the bottom of the vine. And I'm just gonna dap this up around the rim a little bit just to make sure that we don't have any spots that look odd. Then I'm gonna set him gently down on his side and we'll let that dry fully. Once that's completely dry, we're gonna move on to our dry brushing. So I'm gonna grab my fancy palette and a paper towel. For this, we wanna use a lighter shade of green. I'm using Anita's Basil. So we'll give that a good shake and put a little bit onto our palette here. And then for this, we do not want a damp brush. We definitely want the brush to be dry. And I'm gonna use a cheap makeup brush that I got at the dollar store. So I'm gonna work a bit of paint into the tip of the brush, really get some of it into the bristles as best I can. And then I'm gonna work almost all of the paint out into my paper towel. Then using a downward motion, I'm gonna just stroke all over the vine, making sure that I'm catching all of the edges of the texture with the bristles of my brush. This really helps to highlight just the raised areas and keep those deeper areas more shadowed. Now with our leaves, they are completely smooth, so you'll find that there aren't any ridges for it to grab, but the brush itself does have sort of a lined look to it because of the fact that the bristles are spread out a bit. So I find that doing just a quick downward motion from the back of the leaf to the tip of the leaf gives it a nice striped look. And I like to start at the tip and work my way to the base or vice versa. I just like to go from one direction to the other, that way I'm sure that I get the whole thing and that there aren't any areas that I accidentally skip past. And if it seems to you like you haven't caught all of the texture in an area, it's perfectly fine to go from the bottom to the top with your direction. I just like to try and keep my strokes going from the top down because your light tends to come from the top. And make sure to work all the way down to the base. You want to catch all of those hot glue ridges, make sure they stand out nicely. Then we'll just give him a quick once over here. Make sure everything looks even. Yeah, that's looking lovely. Once you're happy with how he looks, just set him aside to dry. And here's a quick before and after look at what my vines look like just with the base coat, and then what it looks like once you get that extra dry brushing. I find it really enhances the look. Once our vine is completely dry, it's time to move on to our wash. So we'll just make sure that we've got our cardboard down to keep our work surface safe. And then I'm gonna take my vine, hold it over the cardboard, and I'm gonna start from below and give a good misting all the way around the vine. Then I'm gonna stand it up on the board and give it a good misting from all four directions from above. This ensures that I get a good coating of the wash all over the plant, and I'm not gonna have any bright areas that stand out later. Then I'm gonna go in with a damp brush and just pull off any puddles of wash that have formed that are darker than I want them to be. Sometimes they'll be just a little bit too much, and it helps to pull that off before it dries. By using a damp brush, it absorbs the wash off much easier than if you use one that's dry. Then once you're happy with how it looks, we're gonna set them aside to dry again. Once that's completely dry, we're gonna go back in and do another coat of dry brushing, but this time going much lighter. So once again, we're gonna grab that fancy palette and paper towel, and I'm using that same basil green that we used before. Now that we've done the black wash, it'll still be lighter. And once again, I'm gonna grab that cheap dollar store makeup brush. I believe this one was listed for eyeshadow, and really work that paint into the bristles. Then work out almost all the paint into the paper towel, and this time we're going further than we did last time, so you really wanna make sure you start with a good amount worked into the bristles. And then we're gonna go back in and we're really hitting just the very high points. So we wanna hit those leading edges of the leaves. And this time you definitely wanna make sure you stick with the strokes going from the top down. This is just the absolute briefest amount of paint being put on just to the very high points. And we'll come back to the leaves and do those side edges. And then make sure we've got some down around the hot glue of the base. Then we'll give him a quick once over, make sure everything is looking good. And I think I want to hit these wires just here a little bit, make them pop a touch more. And when you're happy with that, you're gonna set them aside to dry again. Back with our before and afters, this time the difference is much more subtle. Here the one on the left has been given that final dry brushing, and the one on the right has just been washed. This final dry brushing doesn't make nearly as much of a difference as the first one, but it does make enough of a difference that I do like adding it. Now you can stop right here and have an absolutely wonderful vine, but I like to take things one step further, so I'm gonna add some moss to this vine, really give it some life. So for this you're gonna need a small container to mix in, then I'm gonna add a bit of a blend of foliage into the cup. I'm gonna start off with coarse turf that's colored burnt grass, and get just a bit of that into the cup here. Oh, and make sure I shake it back down into the bag before trying to close it. And you can see I've got about that much in there. Next I'm gonna move to a fine turf in yellow grass, and I'm gonna add just about as much yellow grass as I did the burnt coarse turf. I tried to get roughly the same amount of both. Then I'm gonna finish it off with the Woodland Scenics blended turf for an overall brighter green color. And I'm gonna add a little bit more of that than I did either of the other two, because I don't want this to look too dry and dead. I do want it to be alive. I just want there to be some variety. Then I'm gonna use one of my coffee stir sticks to get a good mix going and make sure that I have no clumps of any one color. This helps to break up that coarse turf a bit too and keep it from being those big lumps that were down in the bottom. Then I'm gonna grab my jar of PVA glue at full strength. We're not watering this down any. And I'm gonna squeeze a healthy amount into the flocking here. I'm gonna start with about this much. Then I'm gonna grab that coffee stirrer and very gently I'm going to work the PVA into the flocking, doing my best not to pour this all over my table. You wanna be gentle with flocking. It is very easy to stir too hard and send it everywhere. So you wanna start small and gentle and slowly work your way up to stirring bigger as everything starts to dampen. Now this is still looking too dry, so I'm gonna grab the PVA and add some more. Give that a good healthy squeeze, and that's about how much more I've added. And then just keep stirring and work that in. And I like making sure to scrape the sides and bottom from time to time to make sure that we're getting into those dry patches that get built up. Otherwise you might find that your center bit has mixed up nice, but you've got this big cake around the edges. No, and that is still a little dry for my purposes, so we are gonna add glue again. I like adding my glue in small amounts because otherwise you wind up chasing adding glue and adding flock and adding glue and adding flock and making far more than you need. All right, and I am liking the look of that consistency. Let's just do a little bit of a smear test here, see how it looks. Yeah, that looks good. So now I'm gonna grab my dried vine. And you can use the coffee stirrer to apply this if you'd like, but it is a little bit big, so I'm gonna switch over to using a toothpick. And you just pick up a clump of this PVA foliage mix and spread it onto the vine. I like trying to press it down into the cracks and crevices to really make sure it gets a good grip, and because those recesses are generally where you're gonna see moss growing on a plant. Now you do want to be careful not to go too crazy with applying the moss. It's easy to do, but you want to make sure to have a good healthy coating over a fair bit of it. This is a plant, so it's not as easy to put too much moss. Really, you just don't want to cover the entire paint job. And let me just tip it up here and make sure I get some on the underside of the vine as well. Once again, those undersides are going to be where it would be more likely to find the moss, so we definitely don't want to miss it. And speaking of using the moss for strength, I'm just gonna pile a little bit on over the top of this wire here to make absolutely sure that he's not gonna move. I'll just scrape a bit off on the underside here, really make sure I've got some stability. Yeah, that looks good. Oh, and we've got a bit of a naked spot here on the base. Let's just make sure we fill in a bit here. There we go. All right, give him a quick once over, make sure we're happy with how everything looks. Touch up a little more back here. And you know what? Let's try and scrape a little bit off onto one of these leaves here. Keep this one from looking quite so bare out here by itself. Oh yeah, I like the look of that. And so once you're pleased with how that looks, go ahead and set this guy aside to dry one final time. Now personally, my final step is to take this outside and give it a good spray with a matte varnish to seal everything in, but that is entirely optional. This is a great project to really just relax and have fun with it and see what shapes you get. I personally like having a good variety of tall, overhanging vines and short little stubby vines. That way when I set them up around a party on the table, it gives me a good variety of height. It makes things a little more interesting to look at. I'd also like to take my traditional moment here to give a big, huge, hearty thank you to my patrons. I know that my posts have been rather few and far between recently, and the fact that you guys have stuck by me means a lot to me. Thank you guys so much for the support. I really appreciate it. And if anyone's interested in joining my Patreon, I do give occasional behind-the-scenes glimpses of things. I've got a link to my Patreon in the description down below. All that being said, let's take a look at how I use these guys on the table. Having successfully completed your quest, the party retires to the closest tavern for a night of revelry and relaxation. Suddenly, there's a low rumble, and the ground begins to shake. The stones of the tavern floor buckle and push upwards as vines erupt all around you, effectively surrounding the whole party. You destroyed all my hybrids, but don't worry, I can always make more. All I need are a few new skeletons to work with, and I think you'll do nicely. Roll for initiative. And so there you have it. That is how I make my animated vines. Tune in next time. I'm going to be showing you how I make my Beholder training dummy. Stick around. Thanks for spending some of your time here with me at Scattered Terrain. If you liked that video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you next time.